What's up guys? So in this video we're going to be looking at how exactly Egyptian temples were built, arranged, and looking at how you can build your own amazing temple with friends in Minecraft. With my tips and tricks to build a new kingdom temple that you'll really love, with a quick time lapse at the end of the video of a little example that we've done, so make sure to stay to the end to check that out. So without further ado, let's get on with the first part of the video, which is looking at the layout of Egyptian temples. So the first point we want to have a look at with the arrangement of an ancient Egyptian temple, particularly the New Kingdom temples, is that they are arranged on an axis. So most of them had a single processional axis that ran in basically a perpendicular nature to the River Nile. Now that is not the only way that these temples were arranged. You did have some temples that were arranged in an east to west axis, which followed the path of the sun. But the main relationship was with the Nile River. There were temples like the Temple of Luxor, which is a very famous New Kingdom temple, which had an east to west axial rotation, which basically meant that it was aligned with the sun. You see Karnak, so this is kind of like a smaller replication of Karnak here, missing a few pylons, but this had two axes. So this had a sun axis and then a river axis. But the main thing that you are going to try and do when planning out your Egyptian temple at the first instance is you want to have some sort of axis, and defining which axis that is. Is it a river axis or is it a sun axis, and then going from there. Now this next point here is we're going to be looking at the actual arrangement and sequence of the interior spaces in a New Kingdom temple. So the typical thing that would be the first space that you would approach, as you can see in this red diagram here, is you would typically approach an avenue of sphinxes. Now this was not the case in every single New Kingdom temple, but in most of them there was some sort of avenue of sphinxes. So as you can see, this would have extended out to the wharf at the river, or this would have extended out to some sort of public facing, city facing area over here maybe. Then your main threshold entrance into the temple is going to be your pylon. Now pylons extended out in loads of different directions from temples. They typically just expanded when the temple expanded, but the pylon basically was a threshold to enter the main public facing area of this building, which was the front courtyard. So what you're going to want to build is you want to build some sort of pylon courtyard at the front, and that's your public area. Then it basically begins to become smaller as you go inwards towards the sanctuary of the temple, with number 2 being the area of the hypostyle hall, which was basically a forest of columns. They varied in size in different temples. Karnak's the biggest example that we've got, but what you're going to want to try and do is you're just going to want to have some sort of hallway with a bunch of columns in it, and I'm going to show that later on. Then the third area is your sanctuary. So this is the smallest area of your temple. This is the most intimate and the most basically private area of your temple, where only priests would have been able to access this typically, and it would have housed the statue of the god, and then it would have housed the bark of the god as well for the processional purposes that you would have had, as well as loads of different little storage rooms that we're going to show later in the video. Now this next thing we want to have a look at is we want to have a look at how the temple steps up into the temple. So basically what happens with ancient Egyptian New Kingdom temples is that the spaces get smaller and they get shorter with lower ceilings as you get further into the building. So what we have here is that on the ground level here, we've got some blocks that are just indicating that that's going to be the ground level. It steps up again into your hypostyle hall, then it steps up again one more time into your sanctuary area, and then steps down again at the back of the foundation. And this basically is just a way to demonstrate that the spaces contract and they get smaller as you get into the temple. So in a way, a good way to think about an ancient Egyptian temple is that it is a sideways pyramid, in that the biggest space is the bottom of the pyramid. That's the most outward facing space where the pylon is, and then where the sanctuary is at the back of the temple, that's where all of your smallest spaces are going to be, as you can see here. And then our last point on the arrangement of the building. So as you see here, we've got basically a green wall that's running around the outside, and we've got the purple wall here. Now what you would have typically had is that you would have had walls that basically space out as you go outwards from these areas, and it basically would be some sort of like Russian doll system where it would go outwards and there would be lots of different walls. Now this green wall is indicating a big perimeter wall. Now this is a very conservative version of what that could be. Typically what you would have had is you would have a thick mud brick wall that would have ran the entire perimeter of what would have been the grain stores, that would have been the housing for the priests, that would have been the bakeries for food, for offerings, all these sorts of things, the farms that the temple would have owned, the sacred lake as well, which we're going to show later in the video, which would have been somewhere over here. So you got to think, how much stuff am I going to need to run this temple? How wide is the wall going to need to be? And how much space do we need inside this in order to enclose this? Because you wouldn't really have had a case where you would have had houses pressed up against the sanctuary. It would have been totally enclosed by a big perimeter wall made of mud brick. Okay, so at this point in the video, we're going to talk a little bit about the materials that I would like to use and I typically use for these ancient Egyptian temples. So what I typically like to use, I like to use bone blocks, quartz bricks, concrete powder, smooth quartz, then these following blocks here. So you've got chiseled sandstone, you've got granite here, you've got dark prismarine, bamboo mosaic, this warped wood here, and then you've got the mangrove wood here as well. So these are kind of like nice colours that reflect the typical colour palette that you would have had in New Kingdom temples. So as you can see here, I've got my quartz bricks that are making up the main part of the pylon. I've got some other types of rock, stone here. So I've got the granite, I've got the andesite, I've got the bamboo here, and then I've added some details on the side. So what I quite like to do is I quite like to just place things like wax lightning rods hanging down, and these look like reeds on the top of the building. You've got things like chains that are just placed on the side here, and then I like to add a couple of other things like bamboo, spruce, just to mix up the colours, because what typically would have happened with ancient Egyptian temples, and you can see this in some of the examples that I'm going to put on the screen now, is that the decoration was layered in bands as you go up the temple. And what you don't want to do in Minecraft is you don't want to put like loads and loads of detail, because you're going to lag your game out basically. So this is like the most minimal approach that you can do without absolutely killing your PC. And I think it looks quite nice. You get a nice kind of effect here. Now, onto columns, what I quite like to do is I quite like to put things like the shelves and then banners with these types of patterns. So you get that nice zigzag pattern on the bottom, with then a mix of buttons, and then as you go up to the top, you kind of like flute out into a lotus flower shape here, with upside down stairs, with bamboo shelves, add a bit of glass here, so that makes an extra bit of shape there, some terracotta, things like that. And as you can see here, we've got this sort of shape where I've mixed the different types of columns. So I've got a taller column, I've got a shorter column. And basically, if you have a very deep hyperstyle hall, you want to basically have a taller section in the middle. So you can see this in Karnak, where there's a taller section in the middle, it raises up, and that basically allows you space for clear story windows here and a higher ceiling without a massive building itself, which allows a bit more light into the hyperstyle hall. Now for smaller columns, what I quite like to do is I quite like to have just simple shapes like this. So I basically repeat what I've done with the bigger columns, but just the same thing with the smaller ones. So I've got the same thing with shelves, I've got some banners, I've got some buttons. Rather than adding loads and loads of like item frames and invisible item frames for these things, it just kills your game. It's better to just add the buttons. And you know, you can do a similar thing where you add the signs, you can add different color blocks to make the bands, and it basically adds the color. So what would have happened with these things, and we can't see this in the modern day because the paint is faded, but ancient Egyptian columns were extremely colorful. They had red, they had blue, they had yellow, they had white, they had all these different colors that they would have added to them. And you can express that in Minecraft to make it look like there are hieroglyphics and paintings on the columns themselves. This is something I quite like to do with this, that you can try and cheat with the banners as well, which is a little bit of help too. Now for this third part of the video, I'm going to be talking about individual specific structures that oftentimes are ignored in these types of builds, and types of buildings that sometimes people might forget to add. So you have things like these, you have your flagpoles out the front. Now you have 4 flagpoles here. Sometimes they would have had 2, sometimes they would have had 1. But the idea is that they're integrated in the structure of the pylon here, and then as the pylon steps back over here, they basically lie straight upwards, and then they would have had these sorts of supports here that I like to make out of shelves, and then some signs, and it has this really nice effect that basically sets it back into the pylon itself. Now another thing is the actual ceilings of a lot of these hallways and a lot of these interior spaces in ancient Egyptian temples. Now this is kind of a mini replica or something very much inspired by the hyperstyle hall of Karnak. And as you can see, you've got decorated clear stories over here, clear story windows, and then you have a very decorative, or as decorative as possible as you can get in Minecraft, ceiling here. So I like to use mangrove trapdoors, I like to use these lightning rods, and you basically get a nice effect on the ceiling of your hyperstyle hall. What I also quite like to do is that on the edges, I quite like to add the fence gates. So you can place fence gates and just knock them in like that, and it has a really nice, basically line effect on the side of a block. And if you set that back in a big enough hallway, it looks like they're just lines that are cut into the block itself. Same thing you can do with buttons as well. So if you mix up lots of different colors of buttons, so here I've just got the pear oak, I've got the warped buttons, and I've got the mangrove ones, you add this really nice effect on the ceiling of your hyperstyle hall or any other building that you have in your complex. Now the same goes for the actual ceilings of your sanctuary building. So here I've got a smaller sanctuary. This is more of an open air sanctuary, but you have a sanctuary here, and you basically have the stars in the sky or something like that of the actual house of the god, as they used to call it. Now, you would have also had some sort of air openings and light openings, so you can get light inside here because you wouldn't have just wanted it totally dark. But if you visited any of the temples in Egypt, or any of the tombs in particular, then they would have had basically these blue starry night skies on the ceilings of much of these roofs, or very decorative roofs at least. And that's what I've kind of tried to replicate here. So I've just used some blue terracotta, I've used some pear-like buttons, and you get this really nice starry effect coupled with some signs with bits of writing on them here and there, just to add a bit of patterns to your interior itself. Now, coming to the sanctuary itself, I actually have put some tiny little bark here. Now, the bark was a very important part of the processional ritual of an ancient Egyptian temple. So it's important that before the actual statue of the god, that you have a bark for basically processional ritual purposes, which is in the main axis of the temple. And then you have the statue or house of the god as such, which is over here. Now, the next thing that seems really obvious, and that sometimes, you might just go, oh, this is kind of an obvious thing, is an obelisk. So obelisks, in the way that they were used traditionally in in the New Kingdom, is that they were sometimes placed in front of the pylon. However, we know for a fact that is not the case, and that is not how obelisks were used in every single temple in ancient Egypt. So in the example of Karnak, you had obelisks between pylons, you had obelisks located within the sanctuary itself. So here's an example of an obelisk basically placed in the sanctuary itself. You would have had obelisks between pylons and way out in the Sphinx processional avenue. But typically, the main locations of your obelisks are going to be in front of pylons, between pylons, and then you might have some exceptions like in Karnak where they're placed in between pylons and sanctuaries and all sorts of things. But they are things that you want to kind of use sparingly because they were very expensive and difficult to build, if you want to be realistic. But if you don't, put them everywhere, no one's going to care. Loads of fun, they look really cool, so it's up to you really how you use them. Now, the next little structure in this that we're going to have a look at are actual grain silos. So you might have seen grain silos like this, that I've just used an example here, that are just typical tall grain silos, or you might have had some sort of silo building like this, where you would have had grain stored inside, and it would have been an open silo where basically it's more for drying purposes and has more space in it. But you can build something like this with basically a barrel vault roof that you just place all around the perimeter of the temple, because that's where the grain would have been stored, that's where much of grain would have been distributed to the public, and temples were a big part of administrative purposes in ancient Egypt, but also because you would have had to have somewhere to store materials and supplies for offerings to the god in the sanctuary. So this is a very important part of the temple itself. The same goes for actual houses. So you would have had houses within the perimeter walls of a temple complex as well. So here we've got a nice little villa. Maybe this is a villa for the head priest or something of this temple, or is where various people live who work in this temple. Exactly. Now, the last feature I'm going to be talking about is the sacred lake. So the sacred lake was a very important part of the actual functional purpose of an ancient Egyptian temple. Sacred lakes were basically used for the washing of priests and priestesses that had to basically wash themselves before they did ceremonies in the sanctuary. So this is one thing that you're not going to want to forget when you if you want to make a proper realistic version of the temple. They also just look really cool. The sacred lake at Karnak's really, really massive and cool. They would have had typically stairs that would have gone down. I mean, you don't have to have stairs on all sides of the sacred lake, but it just makes it a bit more functionally useful. You can get in and out easier, particularly if you're in survival and you just can't get out. It's an extra way to get out of your sacred lake. Now, the last part of this video before the time lapse, we're going to talk about the actual statues and the expansion of New Kingdom temples and how you can replicate that in Minecraft. So overwhelmingly, statues that were present outside of pylons, such as these colossal statues here, were statues of the ruling pharaoh. And the reason why the ruling pharaoh would have put a big statue there is to say, I am the protector of this temple in this period of time, and that's the immortalization of the pharaoh as such. So here we've got 4 statues of perhaps a pharaoh-like figure outside of the temple here, as well as then the expansion of your temple here. You're going to basically want to have, if you're going to want to basically build and make your temple a massive temple, a bigger one like this one, you're going to want to have multiple pylons present in your temple, because what people did is that when a pharaoh succeeded another one, they placed a new pylon on the temple. So Karnak is a big example of this, where they just kept on adding pylons endlessly to the temple, and that's why the thing is so massive. Then another thing that you can do, which is sometimes a bit neglected because we want to just make this perfect thing that I've shown right at the front of this temple here, is that sometimes the pylons added were not finished. So this pylon here is actually an unfinished pylon out here. So maybe the ruler passed away in their rule, maybe the work just wasn't finished. So what you're going to do is just going to have really barren, unpainted quartz brick sort of thing. Even you could have a mud brick pylon. These were common in some places, and we have examples of these where they just have had mud brick pylons. But unfinished pylons add a really nice bit of extra interest to your building, particularly in Minecraft, where you can just save on materials as well and just have a massive thing out the front which you don't need to finish ever, as well as just could be a cool storage room for your survival world. Yeah. So guys, here I'm just putting a quick example of a smaller kind of conventional Egyptian temple right here from the New Kingdom. So I'm just going to have 3 different separate zones, so just your main courtyard, your hypostyle hall, and then a sanctuary area to the back with your pylons at the front, with then some sort of wharf at the front. So I'm just going to leave you for a second with this quick time lapse of quite a nice little temple that we've got here, and show you a tour afterwards. So in this example, guys, I've tried to keep this really simple. So we've got the river and wall running across here, and then I've just built a little wharf area, so you would have had boats coming up to the temple. You've got a small couple of sphinxes out the front, so this could have been a longer avenue with then your pylon in the front. We've got the public facing courtyards. This is basically where people would have come from the public to worship the god. They wouldn't have had access to the main temple, but this is their main worshipping space with a bit of a pond. Then we've got a very small hypostyle hall. I mean, some hypostyle halls are very small. This is quite a small one with some shorter columns, but it still looks really nice. And then as we come back to the sanctuary, it's gotten a bit smaller, and we've got some little storage rooms out to the side. So things that priests would have used to anoint the statue of the god, maybe a study area. This is not fully furnished, but you get the idea. Then we've got the bark in the sanctuary. So this is going to be the main processional bark that runs back and forth between the river. And then we've got the house of the god or statue of the god right here. So you could just put some armor stand with, you know, bits of armor on it, gold armor, but, you know, you could also put like a golem statue or whatever in there, but really whatever you want to do there. To the side here, we've got just general auxiliary areas. So we've got a garden area with a sacred lake. So we've got entrances into our sacred lake where the priests and priestesses can wash themselves. Then we've got a couple of silos to the back here. So this is not like a massive enclosed area, but yeah. I really hope you guys have enjoyed the video. I want to say a big thank you to everyone who's been watching. We've just recently reached 1,000 subscribers and we're almost at 100,000 views. So I want to say a massive thanks to everyone who's been watching. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe. I hope you really enjoyed this video. And until the next one, guys, goodbye.